Chapter 1, Part 2, just because Part 1 was too long. I am on the top of page 12. This begins, if you've seen the movie Sandlot, when they're sitting in the treehouse and they're making s'mores, remember? And Squints goes into this story about the legend of the beast. He's like, the legend of the beast. And then he goes into this story. This is this moment in Mockingbird about the Radleys. According to neighborhood legend, top of page 12, when the younger Radley boy was in his teens, he became acquainted with some of the Cunninghams from Old Sarum, an enormous and confusing tribe domiciled in the northern part of the county, and they formed the nearest thing to a gang ever seen in Macomb. They did little, but enough to be discussed by the town and publicly warned from 3 pulpits. They hung around the barber shop, they rode the bus into Abbotsville on Sundays and went to the picture show. They attended dances in the county's riverside gambling hell, the Dewdrop Inn and fishing camp. They experimented with stump hole whiskey. Nobody in Macomb had nerve enough to tell Mr. Radley that his boy was with the wrong crowd. One night, in an excessive spurt of high spirits, they were drunk. One night, in an excessive spurt of high spirits, the boys backed around the square in a borrowed flivver, resisted arrest by Macomb's ancient beadle, Mr. Connor, and locked him, the cop, and locked him in the courthouse outhouse. The town decided something had to be done. Mr. Connor said he knew who each and every one of them was, and he was bound and determined they wouldn't get away with it. So the boys came before the probate judge on charges of disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, assault and battery, and using abusive and profane language in the presence of a hearing female. Pause. That used to actually be a crime. You couldn't swear around women. I don't know about women who swear. That could be bad. The judge asked Mr. Connor why he included the last charge, and Mr. Connor said they cussed so loud he was sure every lady in Macomb heard them. The judge decided to send the boys to the state industrial school, where boys were sometimes sent for no other reason than to provide them with food and decent shelter. It was no prison, and it was no disgrace. Mr. Radley thought it was. If the judge released Arthur, Mr. Radley would see to it that Arthur gave no further trouble. Knowing that Mr. Radley's word was his bond, the judge was glad to do so. The other boys attended the industrial school and received the best secondary education to be had in the state. One of them eventually worked his way through engineering school at Auburn. The doors of the Radley house were closed on weekdays as well as Sundays, and Mr. Radley's boy was not seen again for 15 years. Pause. So if he's in his teens when this takes place, 15 years later, he's in like his 30s, maybe late 20s, somewhere around there. But there came a day, barely within Jem's memory, when Boo Radley was heard from and seen by several people, but not by Jem. He said Atticus never talked much about the Radleys. When Jem would question him, Atticus's only answer was for him to mind his own business and let the Radleys mind theirs. They had a right to. But when it happened, Jem said Atticus shook his head and said, So Jem received most of his information from Miss Stephanie Crawford, a neighborhood scold. That means gossip. So Jem received most of his information from Miss Stephanie Crawford, a neighborhood gossip, who said she knew the whole thing. According to Miss Stephanie, Boo was sitting in the living room cutting some items from the Macomb Tribune to paste in his scrapbook. His father entered the room. As Mr. Radley passed by, Boo drove the scissors into his parents' leg, pulled them out, wiped them on his pants, and resumed his activities. Mrs. Radley ran screaming into the street that Arthur was killing them all. But when the sheriff arrived, he found Boo still sitting in the living room cutting the Tribune. He was 33 years old then. Miss Stephanie said old Mr. Radley said no Radley was going to any asylum, any crazy place, when it was suggested that a season in Tuscaloosa might be helpful to Boo. Boo wasn't crazy. He was high-strung at times, and it was all right to shut him up, Mr. Radley conceded, but insisted that Boo not be charged with anything. He was not a criminal. The sheriff hadn't the heart to put him in jail alongside Negroes, so Boo was locked in the courthouse basement. Boo's transition from the basement to back home was nebulous in Jem's memory. Miss Stephanie Crawford said some of the town council told Mr. Radley that if he didn't take Boo back, Boo would die of mold from the damp. Besides, Boo could not live forever on the bounty of the county. Nobody knew what form of intimidation Mr. Radley employed to keep Boo out of sight, but Jem figured that Mr. Radley kept him chained to the bed most of the time. Atticus said no, it wasn't that sort of thing, that there were other ways of making people into ghosts. Pause. That's such a good quote. So Jem thinks that they keep him locked, chained to a bed, and Atticus says no, there are other ways of making people into ghosts. Think about a ghost. What does a ghost symbolize? Like nothing, invisible. There are other ways of making people feel invisible. Can you think of other ways of making people feel invisible? When you yell at them, when you're mean to them, when you ignore them. So Jem thinks that he stays in the house because he's chained to the bed, and Atticus says, no, there are other ways that people can hurt other people and make them do that. My memory came alive to see Mrs. Radley occasionally open the front door, walk to the edge of the porch, and pour water on her flowers. But every day Jem and I would see Mr. Radley walking to and from town. He was a thin, leathery man with colorless eyes, so colorless they did not reflect light. His cheekbones were sharp and his mouth was wide, with a thin upper lip and a full lower lip. Miss Stephanie Crawford said he was so upright that he took the word of God as his only law, and we believed her because Mr. Radley's posture was ramrod straight. He never spoke to us. When he passed, we would look at the ground and say, "Good morning, sir," and he would cough in reply. Mr. Radley's elder son lived in Pensacola. He came home at Christmas, and he was one of the few persons we ever saw enter or leave the place. From the day Mr. Radley took Arthur home, people said the house died. But there came a day when Atticus told us he'd wear us out if we made any noise in the yard, and commissioned Calpurnia to serve in his absence if she heard a sound out of us. Mr. Radley was dying. He took his time about it. Wooden sawhorses blocked the road at each end of the Radley lot. Straw was put down on the sidewalk. Traffic was diverted to the back street. Dr. Reynolds parked his car in front of our house and walked to the Radleys every time he called. Jem and I crept around the yard for days. At last the sawhorses were taken away, and we stood watching the front porch. We stood watching from the front porch when Mr. Radley made his final journey past our house. Final journey? They're carrying him out. He's dead. There goes the meanest man God ever blew breath into, murmured Calpurnia, and she spat meditatively into the yard. We looked at her in surprise, for Calpurnia rarely commented on the ways of white people. Pause, I got to talk about that. So Calpurnia is African American, a black woman that is kind of the nanny. She takes care of the kids. And when Mr. Radley is taken out of the house on a stretcher because he's dead, Calpurnia, a black woman, makes a derogatory comment about a white man, even though he's dead. This is dangerous, right? This is absolutely a dangerous thing, and it shows how. Sorry, my nose is running. It shows how much how negatively she thinks of him. She wouldn't comment on that. She would keep that to herself because it's dangerous, but she really, really thinks he's a bad human, that father. The neighborhood thought when Mr. Radley went under, Boo would come out. But it had another thing coming. Boo's elder brother returned from Pensacola and took Mr. Radley's place. The only difference between him and his father was their ages. Jem said Mr. Nathan Radley bought cotton too. Mr. Nathan would speak to us, however, when we said good morning, and sometimes we saw him coming from a town with a magazine in his hand. The more we told Dill about the Radleys, the more he wanted to know. The longer he would stand hugging the light pole on the corner, the more he would wonder. "Wonder what he does in there," he would murmur. "Looks like he'd just stick his head out the door." Jem said he goes out all right when it's pitch dark. Miss Stephanie Crawford said she woke up in the middle of the night one time and saw him looking straight through the window at her. Said his head was like a skull looking at her. "Ain't you ever waked up at night and heard him, Dill? He walks like this." Jem slid his feet through the gravel. "Why do you think Miss Rachel locks up so tight at night? I've seen his tracks in our backyard many a morning, and one night I heard him scratching on the back screen, but he was gone by the time Atticus got there." "Wonder what he looks like," said Dill. Remember, these are 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 9-year-old who've never seen him. Wonder what he looks like, said Dill. Jem gave a reasonable description of Boo. Boo was about 6.5 feet tall, judging from his tracks. He dined on raw squirrels and any cats he could catch. That's why his hands were bloodstained. If you ate an animal raw, you could never wash the blood off. There was a long, jagged scar that ran across his face. What teeth he had were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped and he drooled most of the time. Let's try to make him come out, said Dill. I'd like to see what he looks like. Jem said if Dill wanted to get himself killed, all he had to do was go up and knock on the front door. Our first raid came to pass only because Dill bet Jem, the gray ghost, against two Tom Swifts that Jem wouldn't get any farther than the Radley gate. In all of his life, Jem had never declined a dare. By the way, the gray ghost, that's a comic book, just so you know. So they're making a wager here. And Jem, because he's 10 and he's cool, or he's 9 and he's cool, you can't back out on a dare. Jem thought about it for 3 days. I suppose he loved honor more than his head, for Dill wore him down easily. You're scared, said Dill the first day. I ain't scared, just respectful, Jem said. The next day, Dill said, You're too scared to put your big toe in the front yard. Jem said he reckoned he wasn't. He'd passed the Radley place every single school day of his life. Always running, I said. But Dill got him the third day when he told Jem that folks in Meridian certainly weren't as afraid as the folks in Macomb, that he'd never seen such scary folks as the ones in Macomb. This was enough to make Jem march to the corner, where he stepped and leaned against the light pole, watching the gate hang crazily on its homemade hinge. I hope you've got it through your head that he'll kill us each and every one, Dill Harris, said Jem, when we joined him. Don't blame me when he gouges your eyes out. You started it, remember? You're still scared, murmured Dill patiently. Jem wanted Dill to know once and for all that he wasn't scared of anything. It's just that I can't think of a way to make him come out without him getting us. Besides, Jem had his little sister to think of. Okay, pause. That is a load of crap. Basically, Jem is saying, I can't go up to the house and do that because he's going to kill me. And if I die, oh my Lord, who would take care of my darling younger sister? That means he's scared. This is what Scout says. When he said that, I knew he was afraid. Jem had his little sister to think of, the time I dared him jump off the top of the house. If I got killed, what'd become of you? He asked. Then he jumped, landed unhurt, and his sense of responsibility left him until confronted by the Radley place. You gonna run out on a dare? Asked Dill. If you are, then... Dill, you have to think about these things, Jem said. Let me think a minute. It's sort of like making a turtle come out. How's that? Asked Dill. You strike a match under him. I told Jem if he set fire to the Radley house, I was going to tell Atticus on him. Okay, pause. There are 3 levels of understanding here, right? Jem is like, he's going to kill me. And Dill is like, no, he's not. You're going to be fine. And they're talking about this striking a match and putting a match under a turtle. They're not talking about that literally. They're not going to get a turtle and put a match under him. But that's what Scout thinks. And Scout's like, oh my God, if you get a turtle and put a match under him, I'm going to tell Dad on you. And they're like, no, that's not what we're talking about. I told Jem if he set fire to the Radley house, I was going to tell Atticus on him. Dill said striking a match under a turtle was hateful. It ain't hateful, it just persuades him. It's not like you chunk him in the fire, Jem growled. How do you know a match don't hurt him? Turtles can't feel, stupid, said Jem. Were you ever a turtle? My stars, Dill. Now, let me think. Reckon we can rock him? Jem stood so long in thought that Dill made a mild concession. I won't say you ran out on a dare, and I'll swap you the gray ghost if you just go up and touch the house. Touch the house? Jem brightened. Touch the house, that all? Dill nodded. Are you sure that's all? I don't want you hollering something different the minute I get back. Yeah, that's all, said Dill. He'll probably come out after you when he sees you in the yard, and then Scout and me will jump on him and hold him down till we can tell him we ain't going to hurt him. Okay, pause. This is their plan. Jem is going to go touch the house, and the other 2 are going to wait right there in case he comes out, and then they're going to jump on him and hold him down, the 30-some-odd-year-old man, and tell him that they're not going to hurt him. This is the plan. Here we go. We left the corner. We left the corner, crossed the side street that ran in front of the Radley house, and stopped at the gate. "Well, go on," said Dill. "Scout me's right behind you." "I'm going," said Jem. "Don't hurry me." He walked to the corner of the lot and back again, studying the simple terrain as if deciding how best to effect an entry, frowning and scratching his head. Then I sneered at him. Jem threw open the gate and sped to the side of the house, slapped it with his palm, and ran back past us, not waiting to see if his foray was successful. Dill and I followed on his heels. Safely on our porch, panting and out of breath, we looked back. The house was the same, droopy. The old house was the same, droopy and sick. But as we stared down the street, we thought we saw an inside shutter move. Flick, a tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still. Okay, end. Uh, so they run up. Jem touches the house. They run back to their house. They turn around. They're looking back. They're panting. They're scared. And they look and they see a little movement. The inside shutter. Notice the word inside. The inside shutter, not the outside shutter. Inside. Couldn't have been moved from the outside. Couldn't have been moved from Jem touching. It had to be physically moved from the inside. So if it was physically moved from the inside, it means someone's sitting there. It means someone is watching them. Pay attention to the ends and the beginnings of chapters. The author does a beautiful job with some foreshadowing and some imagery and kind of making you wonder what's next. End of chapter 1. See you for chapter 2, y'all.